Welcome to the Listening Time Podcast. Hey everybody, this is Connor and you're listening to episode 155 of the Listening Time Podcast. This episode is a very special one. I'm not doing what I normally do. It's not gonna be just me talking. I'm actually gonna have a conversation, an interview with Lindsay from All Ears English. Some of you might already know who I'm talking about. Some of you might have already listened to the All Ears English podcast. So maybe you're already familiar with her and maybe you're not. Either way, I think this will be a really interesting episode for you because we're going to talk about reaching a high intermediate level in English. Lindsay is going to give some tips for all of you that are at a lower intermediate level or an upper beginner level. She'll give some really good tips on how to reach that high intermediate level. And so this will be very useful for you. And it'll be really good practice for your listening. This is the first time that I've hosted someone on this normal podcast. I talk to other people on my US Conversations podcast, but I've never done this here on the Listening Time podcast. So this is the first time that I've done this on this podcast. And Lindsay and I talk at normal speed during this interview. So we're not slowing down and talking really clearly. So this will be the most challenging episode that you've listened to. But that's good. It's good to challenge yourself. And I want to mention that if you like this episode after listening to it, and you want more content like this, where I'm talking to other people at normal speed, then make sure to sign up for my US Conversations podcast, because that's what I do in every episode of that podcast. So if you like this interview, then make sure to sign up for my US Conversations podcast so you can practice with more content like this, okay? All right, so the intro is done, and now I'll let you listen to my conversation with Lindsay. Okay, everyone, I'm extremely excited for today's episode. This is the first time, I believe, it's the first time that I've actually had a guest on the show. Some of you might already know our guest. Maybe you've already listened to her on her podcast or her other content. But I'm here with Lindsay today from All Ears English. And Lindsay McMahon is the co-host of All Ears English. The All Ears English podcast has 1.3 million followers on Apple Podcasts and Spotify globally. It's downloaded 4.5 million times per month and was ranked in the best of Apple Podcasts categories in 2018 and 2019, as well as number 1 in U.S. education language courses. Lindsay and her team have been featured in Podcast Magazine, Language Magazine, and Forbes. Lindsay, welcome. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you, Connor. I am excited to be here, and I'm honored to be your first guest ever on your show.
Yes. Thank you so much. I'm excited for this. I'm not a typical podcast host, so this is kind of my first time hosting something like this. So hopefully I don't do too badly. But I know that you're someone that has a lot to offer to my audience. Everyone listening is an English learner, and I would guess the majority of the people listening are probably at an upper beginner, that might be the lowest end, to lower intermediate level. I'm guessing that's probably the majority of my audience here. And I think that you have brought a very interesting topic to the show today. I think you want to talk about helping lower intermediate English learners reach a higher intermediate level. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. I would love to talk today about how your listeners and students of English in general can move from that low intermediate into mid intermediate to higher intermediate. So we're talking today about going from maybe A2 B1 into B2, right? Up
Great.
to that point where we can really start to connect and have real
Great.
conversations that we feel good about. Yeah.
Awesome. When I think about B2, or when I think about just kind of the general upper intermediate level of any language, as a language learner, I think of that level as the point when I can start to feel kind of comfortable in the language, in the
Yeah.
sense that I can operate in the language. I can maybe even live in that country and be okay. And
Yeah.
obviously, I'm going to have plenty of errors still, but I'm going to actually be fairly comfortable in the language. I'm going to have a level where people look at me and say, oh, yeah, he's got a pretty good level of Spanish or a pretty good
Sure.
level of Portuguese or whatever. How would you classify kind of an upper intermediate level?
Yeah, I agree. And we just did another appearance over on All Ears English where you
Yes.
joined me, Connor, and we talked about that level, that B2 level moving into that advanced C1 level. But yeah,
Right.
I think it is basically, you described it well. It's when you essentially can do pretty much anything. You can pull off any task. You can have a conversation with pretty much anyone at the B2 level. The question is, are you starting to repeat words over and over? Is your vocabulary actually quite limited? Even though you can
Right.
accomplish a task, you're still missing a lot, missing jokes, missing nuances. But today we want to get to that point where we want to, there's every language learning journey has steps, and we have to take it one step at a time, which is fine. Right?
Right. Well, that's a perfect description, and I'm excited to hear your tips. I believe you've got a few tips for us, actionable steps that people can take to actually kind of help them get to that level, right? So, if you could you share with us some tips, some
Yeah.
things that people can incorporate into their language learning?
Yeah. So first I'm going to start, Connor, with the philosophy, because
Okay.
it's all about a mindset. And over on my podcast, All Ears English, our philosophy, it's our trademark as well, but more importantly, it's our mindset, is
Okay.
connection, not perfection. And the reason that we believe in connection, not perfection, is it matters for every level. It's not just for upper intermediate or advanced speakers. It works for beginners. What it means is that you never sacrifice human connection. When you hear yourself make a mistake, what we don't want to do is clam up. A lot of times what students will do, especially at the lower intermediate or beginner level, they'll feel themselves make a mistake. They'll drop eye contact immediately. They'll clam up. You can see the stress in the shoulders. They will actually back away from the human being in front of them. But what
Right.
our philosophy says is never do that. Never allow a mistake to sever a connection opportunity. So when we make a mistake, we actually maintain that eye contact. We stay in the conversation. We don't back away. And it's
Right.
important. I want your listeners to know this, because it's especially important at this level, the beginner to low intermediate level, because if we start to get into a pattern where our mistakes start to rule us or start to dictate how we act around other people, native speakers or non-native speakers, we're set on the wrong track. So I want your
Right.
listeners to kind of make sure that connection is the ultimate goal. It's not being correct.
That's a great point. I really like that. And it really is something that we can get caught up with if we think that it's about perfection. It's about not making a single mistake. We think that everyone's eyes are on us. And as soon as we say something unnatural or wrong, people just judge us. That's not reality, right? The person that you're talking to wants that connection with you. So you should strive to have that connection with them. Just be understood and actually allow that connection to kind of motivates you to speak and to actually do so more effectively. So that's a really great philosophy. Thank you for sharing that with us. So with that being said, what are the ways that philosophy can kind of be put into actionable steps for
Yeah,
people?
for sure. So one of the interesting mistakes that I see people making, even at the low intermediate to high beginner level, is there's too much of a laser focus on the mechanics of the language. Yes, we
Mm,
need grammar at the beginner to intermediate level, but we're missing culture. So what students tend to
right.
do is that they don't learn culture in parallel with the mechanics of the language. Okay.
Mm,
So what ends up happening is we get to a point, an arbitrary point where we feel like, okay, now we can learn culture. We can go back and implement culture. And now it's kind of too late. We need to learn them in parallel. Number one, so
mm,
it stays interesting and enjoyable. So we have
right.
material we can actually relate to people with, right? We could start those
Right.
conversations. And so we built a course at All Ears English many years ago. I took a road trip actually around the U.S., went to your home
Oh,
state of
nice.
California, went to the Wild West, Wyoming, Texas, New York City, went everywhere. Interviewed native
Wow.
speakers of all different lifestyles and philosophies. And we brought those interviews in. So we started with a base of cultural conversations, talking about things like food and drink trends, but so lighter things, but also history of the US, heavy issues, homelessness, the culture of California, the traffic in California, the
Right.
surf culture. These are things that are going to keep us motivated, but also if we're not learning this early on, what is the actual material from which we're going to start conversations when we do have
Right.
the right construction? We're not going to have it. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. What is
Hmm.
there to talk about? What
Yeah.
is there to connect with other people if you have no connection to their world, their reality, if you just have a
Yeah.
complete textbook
Kind of.
view of the language, right? And that's what
Yeah.
you're trying to avoid and actually get that real world material and which is really motivating. It's really exciting and interesting to
Yeah.
learn about that stuff. And it also, in addition, gives you that common ground where you can talk about real things that matter with that person,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly. In All Ears English, we
Cool.
really believe that, again, it comes back to the human connection. It's not about learning some kind of a formula, right? We're not doing
Right.
math problems here. We are actually
Sure.
learning to use it to eventually do
Right.
something more important than just saying the words. So I think
Right.
it's really important for listeners at every level to keep that in mind.
Yeah, that's a great point. I always say this. I think I've said it multiple times on this podcast that learning a language is not like learning math. It's not that same process. It's not the same goal. It's not,
Mhm.
there isn't the same, let's say, underlying motive to learn it. Like you're mentioning, this is about actually communicating with people
Yeah.
and actually having experiences with other
Yeah.
people. So that's awesome. I
Yeah.
really like that
And
first
and
tip.
let me
Yeah,
just throw out a quick example, right?
sure.
So, an interesting cultural conversation, for example, could be that you and I could have right now, Connor, is the difference
Yeah.
between New York City and Los Angeles. Are you an
Oh,
LA
yeah.
person or are you a New York person? I'm a New York
Right.
person. You might be
Oh,
an
wow.
LA person. I don't know exactly, but this is a rich conversation. And there's absolutely no reason why, at a lower level, your listeners can't have this conversation too. You could have
Right.
pieces and start to build the building blocks for this conversation. There's no point at which you then have that permission to go and talk about interesting
Right.
things. We can start now. Okay.
Yeah, that's something that native speakers would talk about amongst each
Yeah.
other, and that's something that people at a lower level or a lower intermediate level can also talk about as well.
Yes.
It's not
Yes. Yeah.
forbidden,
Yeah.
and it'll actually kind of help them improve,
You got
right?
it. And then just falling back on the philosophy, of course, at the beginner level to low intermediate, your conversation is going to be different from what it would look like
Right.
at the B2 to C1 level. And that's totally fine. That's how we
Yeah.
fall back to connection, not perfection. Maybe I know a few words about, urban. I know words like urban, cityscape. Maybe I know a few
Right.
basic words. I use what I can, and then I find the human connection in that conversation. And then a few years later, I'm having a more vibrant conversation. But there's no reason why we can't have access to these topics at the lower level.
I agree 100%. Thank you very much for that tip. So, what else? What else do you
Yeah.
have for
All
us?
right. So I think in order to get there, right, to get from that B1 level into B2, into C1, get into advanced, it comes down to habits, Connor, because anything that
Mhm.
I've ever accomplished in my life is about repetition. That means we
Right.
need listening. So exposing
Yeah.
yourself to a very small dose of interesting listening material on a daily or near daily basis is really key. So I think people think, why can't I have that conversation? Well, listening is an important piece. So if you're only working within a textbook, or if you're only practicing when it comes to actually speaking, you're missing that foundation. So find
Right.
something you love, find a podcast, find a YouTube channel, 10 to 15 minutes a day, make it regular. Don't try to understand everything. We've had listeners of our show come back and say, oh, I found you, in 2017 and I could understand 50%, but I thought it was fun. So I stuck with it. And now I understand 75%.
Cool.
That is a huge win when you can see that
Yes.
increase. And that's going to give you that endowed progress effect, which is a psychological mechanism where we know the brain gets excited and motivated to continue when we see a little improvement. So make sure what you're listening is interesting. Listening to is actually interesting, and you're seeing that gradual improvement, but expose yourself to the language on a daily basis.
Yeah. Well, I just have to say to my listeners, I didn't prep Lindsay before she said all this. People that are listening are going to say, she sounds like what Connor always says. So I did not, we're not conspiring together but we didn't do that before this talk. That's her own advice. And that's what I always tell my listeners here. I really stress, of course, just the amount of listening that you do and doing it frequently, like you mentioned, hopefully every day if you can. I know it seems like a hard thing. Oh, every day, that's a lot. Well, not really. If you think of the other things we do every single day, even just for 5-10 minutes, you see that there are a lot of things that we do every single day. And turning on your favorite podcast or whatever it is in English is not that hard to do every day, at least for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, like you mentioned. And like you said, if you're using engaging content, if you're using interesting content, it goes beyond just, I got to do my English today. It's, I wonder what Lindsay has to say on this episode. You're actually you care about the content, and that focuses your mind on actually maybe understanding more than you would if it were boring content, let's say. I'm just doing English just to do it. Right?
I think it's important to find something that feels a bit like edutainment. Right. So it's not education 100% because we don't want it to feel like we're back in school. We're adult learners here, right? We're not sitting in our classroom as kids, but it's also a little more than just pure entertainment where we're laughing. We can actually find a combination of the two, and we call it edutainment. It's out there.
That's awesome.
Okay. Yeah.
I love that. Cool. That's what I'm going to refer to now when I'm talking about that combination of doing something fun and doing something that's educational for you. Edutainment. I love that. Cool. And do you have one other tip for us?
Yeah, for sure. The next tip is, so we've talked about the importance of, a regular listening habit. And we have talked about involving yourself in cultural conversations, have access immediately. There's no permission slip where we say, okay, now you can go into interesting things with your English. You don't have to just learn constructions. Now I want to say, get a foothold early when it comes to speaking. I think there's another unwritten rule that a lot of students think they have to wait before actually beginning speaking. For some reason, they feel like they have to get past a certain point. I would push back on that and say, start speaking early. I like to practice my Spanish with my tutor on italki. I'm getting ready for a trip to Panama in a couple of weeks, and I've just hired a tutor to jump on with once a week for half an hour. Very simple. Find a way to do it. We've done tons of episodes on ways you can actually start speaking. There's a lot of things you can do. You can even get on the phone with customer service for whatever product, whatever you have to do, you can find a way to start speaking. But one key here that I want to make sure your listeners know is don't pretend to understand. I think a lot of times we feel like we have to pretend to understand. This gets us into trouble later.
Right.
So that's
happened to me.
Make sure you feel like you're in a safe space. You're speaking with someone where you can push back a bit and use the key phrases. Have the tools in your back pocket. Saying something like, sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Or what was that? Could you say that one more time? Again, we've done tons of episodes on what to ask. Have some tools, push back, and put yourself into situations where you will feel comfortable asking for that repetition. We're not talking about 3 hours of practice a day. We're talking, again, 5 to 10 minutes just using the words.
Yes, that's great advice. My listeners kind of think of me as the listening guy. And of course, my podcast is called Listening Time, and I stress listening, listening, listening. That's
Yeah.
kind of the main thing I shove down people's throats, kind of. However, like you said, you are never going to be a good speaker if you don't speak, obviously. And so I want to make that clear, even though I'm a huge proponent of listening and input and getting that engaging content.
Mhm.
And that's kind of the skeleton, the base of your knowledge in the language. You gotta actually speak, right?
Yeah.
You do have to get that practice in, and it's gonna really motivate you to maybe do more than what you would have done, do more English, do more listening, go further, spend more time with the language, because when you do actual speaking practice, you get that connection that you've been talking about. It's not just you consuming something, some
Right.
interesting content. You're
Yeah.
actually getting to connect with a person. And that's really cool. That's one of the most rewarding parts of learning a language. And so, me, for
Yeah.
example, I've done a lot of French listening practice. And this year, I'm actually going to stop just kind of listening, kind of in the background, or listening when I have
Yeah.
some free time and just doing that. I've realized that I haven't really spoken.
Ah,
And there's a
yes.
problem with that, because there's only so much I can do,
Yeah.
or there's only I can't reach a really high level if I don't just start speaking. So my goal
Yeah.
for the rest of this year is to actually just get my feet wet and
Yeah.
actually start speaking.
I
So
love that,
I like
Connor.
that advice.
That's so good. I think as adults, and I love that example of the French learning, as adult learners, we need quick wins. We need quick
Yeah,
wins. And I think part of that win is not just listening, it's speaking. I also
right.
think it's smart for your listeners at the low intermediate level to start speaking so we don't
Right.
develop toxic habits. I notice a lot of my friends who are native speakers of English, they learn Spanish in school, but they're
Hmm.
afraid to speak it. They feel awkward, they feel
Mm,
embarrassed. And
right.
somewhere they developed that habit, and it probably came from not speaking much.
Okay.
Right.
I
So
see.
so I
Right.
think that the way to get around that is from a low level. You're already right in there. You're getting in there. You're speaking. You're
Right.
becoming intimate with the language in that speaking way. So you don't develop that embarrassment or that
There
awkwardness
you
where you're
go.
you're
Yeah.
afraid to
Hmm.
even let other speakers of your language hear you speak this other language. Don't let it
Right.
get to that point, and the way to do it is to speak early.
Yes, that's so true. We develop these kind of nervous habits, this
Yeah.
embarrassment, this almost shame sometimes that people have, like, oh,
Yeah.
did someone hear me say what I
Yeah.
just said?
Yeah.
Is anyone listening? We don't want to have that,
Yeah,
right?
it's interesting, isn't it? And I think
Yeah,
when
right.
kids learn a language, like bilingual kids, when they learn as kids, they don't go through that as much if they,
Right.
because they haven't developed the self-consciousness yet. So how can
Yes.
so as adults we know we might be susceptible. What are the things we can do to override that tendency of the
Yeah.
human mind? Yeah.
Right. Perfect. Wow. What a great tip. So, those are really kind of clear, actionable things that people can do. And remember, we're talking about people mostly in the lower intermediate
Yeah.
range here. And I don't think many people would say, oh, if you're in the lower intermediate range, it's still way too early for you to talk and to connect with people and to have this human connection. You got to spend some more time with the books. I don't think that really anyone would have that philosophy, especially if you're at a lower intermediate level. Dive in and actually enjoy that human connection that you can establish with other people in that language. Use that to feed your motivation, use that to keep you going, and you'll reach that upper intermediate level. Would you agree with that?
100% Connor. That's it. I mean, that is
Yeah.
our whole idea here. Connection is available to every human being on this planet. It is our birthright, right? As
Right.
human beings, we have the right to connect with other human beings. And
Right.
so, of course, like I said, it's going to look different at the intermediate beginner level than it will at the advanced level, but that's okay because that's where
Yeah.
we're at. Okay.
Exactly.
Yes.
Cool. Well, this has been great. And before we go, I do want to give you the chance to tell our listeners where they can find you, where they can listen to you. Tell us about All Ears English.
All right. So you've basically heard our philosophy again, which I said is connection, not perfection. Every episode comes back to how can we find those moments of human connection. We teach you a lot of vocabulary, idioms, expressions, grammar. We have a business English podcast as well, but the best place to get started would just be by opening the search bar wherever your listeners are listening, whether it's Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Open the search bar, type in All Ears English, and you're going to see a lot of yellow branding coming up. And just hit follow on the All Ears English podcast. That will get you started with us. Again, we bring all of our episodes back to the connection moment. Good stuff.
Awesome.
Yes.
Well, all of you listeners, go do that after you're done with this episode, and I'm sure you'll benefit from all of the content that Lindsay has to offer. So, well, this was a great first episode for me hosting someone else. I really appreciate your time and for your valuable tips, Lindsay. Thank you so much for being here and talking with us today. And it was really nice exchanging with you. And have a great rest of your day, okay?
Yeah, thank you, Connor, for having me on your show. I appreciate it. See you next time.
My pleasure.
All
Bye-bye.
right. Bye.
All right, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that interview that I had with Lindsay. I'm sure that was difficult for a lot of you, but it's great that you're challenging yourself with this type of content. And remember that if you want more of these types of conversations where I'm speaking to another person at normal speed, then of course, make sure to sign up for my US Conversations podcast. The link is down below in the episode description. That's patreon.com/US Conversations. And if you're not ready for this content yet, but you want to reach that level where you can understand these types of conversations, then make sure to become a Listening Time family member so you can start to practice with my advanced podcast episodes. This will be a good way to help you eventually reach that level where you can start to listen to me having conversations with other people. The middle step in between this Listening Time podcast and my US Conversations podcast is probably my advanced episodes in which I speak fast. So you can practice with those and it's still just me speaking. And then eventually you can try my US Conversations podcast when you feel ready. And of course, the link to become a Listening Time family member is down below in the episode description. That's patreon.com/listening time. All right. Well, I really hope you enjoyed this special episode, and I'll talk to you on the next episode of Listening Time.